Chapter 4 Hunting Season. The weekends were periods of silence and refreshment. In spite of the isolation, I found the life satisfying. In the daytime, I would lift up mine eyes unto the hills, where big white clouds in a blue sky bumped along the rim of the mountain ranges, and at night I watched the shadow of the mountains on the slope opposite retreat before the rising moon, and listened to the distant barking of the coyotes floating across the valley. I spent singing hours beautifying my cabin, all the rough woodwork in the kitchen, shelves, cupboards, bench, chairs, table. I painted with white enamel paint. I had ordered green sprigged white muslin from Clinton, and the little girls measured my windows and cut out and made up dainty curtains. The pans and lids gleamed on the pan shelf, and on the white table the bowl of snowberries, rose hips, choke cherries, and autumn leaves made a pool of delight. Every time I opened the door to come into my house, I felt welcomed, but not, alas, by human companionship. I sometimes yearned to have my friends drop in, but they were far, far away. The ranchers' wives in the valley made no social advances. I had not even a dog or a cat for company, so I developed the habit of talking to myself. I planned the decoration of my bedroom, this in deep cream paint, to match the plain wood of the chest of drawers and dark stained floor. In my imagination, I polished the floor till it shone like a mirror. Little did I think that in the spring it would be graced by the tawny skin of a cougar. October 31st is Halloween, and traditionally the children's festival in Canada. We must have a party, of course, but when I discussed it with the children, they told me that any party at the schoolhouse would be attended by the whole population of the valley and its environs. So I let them write invitations to all their friends as an exercise in correct letter writing, and on the day before the party we carried out all the desks onto the hillside and scrubbed and mopped the school. I had ordered a quantity of fireworks from Ashcroft and 2 cases of pop for sale, and these were delivered by the stage the week before the event. 2 of the older boys were to act as barmen, and excitement was intense. There was much preoccupation with the making of masks, and lanterns were contrived from pumpkins and empty syrup tins. As the day approached, I became rather nervous. I did not know how to entertain adults in this sort of a community, and I wondered if I should have to cope with drunkenness or hooliganism. I had sent an invitation as a matter of courtesy to the school board secretary at Ashcroft, but that was only a gesture. No one would want to make that journey just for an evening party. However, when I was eating my usual solitary supper around 6 o'clock, I heard a sudden fanfare on klaxon horns, and my cabin was lit up with the glare from the headlamps of 2 cars as they swept down from the road onto the trail. They drew up at my door in the darkness, and out tumbled an incredible number of people, Mr. and Miss Mattick and their small daughter, John and their 2 children, the principal of the Ashcroft School with his wife and 2 little boys, and 3 young girl teachers. They had been driving since 3 o'clock and had had no meal. Now they surged into my kitchen carrying boxes and baskets and cardboard dishes, and in a few seconds they were all hard at work, buttering rolls, opening tins of beans, frying sausages and eggs and tomatoes, making coffee. Nick and John were both 6-footers, and their 10-gallon hats brushed the ceiling. All available seating accommodation was put into use, supplemented by logs from the wood pile, and anyone who could not find a seat sat on the floor or on somebody's knee, or just stood up. The school children were now arriving, and into the patch of light cast by the windows would flit strange apparitions, shrouded in garments made out of old sacks, and carrying their ghoulish lanterns. The little visitors, who had been warned to watch out for the Hallogoons and ghosties, skipped about with shrieks of delicious terror, taking refuge in the cabin when the excitement was too intense. At last the party began. The lads who had long left school joined with gusto in the unsophisticated singing games, which to me spelt a children's party, spurred and hatted in their gayest neckerchiefs. They pranced up and down to play the grand old Duke of York, and oranges and lemons, and nuts in May. The barman did a roaring trade with the pop, and when they had sold out, as it was now quite dark, we all went out onto the mountainside to watch the fireworks. Oohs and ahs reverberated as the rockets whizzed skywards, or the cascades of golden sparks fell from the spinning wheels, and every child had 2 or 3 sparklers to twirl round for himself. The next event was supper. Miss Mattick had brought an enormous iced cake, as light as thistledown, and the ranchers' wives had sent chocolate iced cakes, and apples, and candies, and the children's mothers had brought chicken sandwiches, and more iced cakes and cookies. They made coffee in a pail on the stove in my house, and brought it over to the school. When the party was in full swing, our town visitors had to say goodbye, but no one else seemed to have any intention of moving, so I racked my brains for some other form of entertainment. Had I but known it, all they wanted was to dance, to twirl madly in square dances all night long. This discovery came later. As it was, I hit on the idea of shadow play. We draped a sheet over the archway at the back of the room and put the lamps behind it. Then the children performed actions in mime close to the sheet, and the audience guessed who they were and what they were doing. This caused great amusement, and the people were reluctant to go home, even after midnight. There was a thin silver edge of moon to light the riders home, and I stood at my door, listening to the receding drum of hoof beats on the earth road, grateful for the success of our first party. Towards the end of October, I had received an invitation to attend the teachers' convention, to be held at the end of the following week in the city of Kamloops. This was an occasion not to be missed, as it would provide an opportunity for me to meet my colleagues in the teaching profession and to become acquainted with the representatives of the Department of Education in the area. But there were difficulties to be overcome. Teachers wishing to attend the convention were authorized to close school on the Thursday afternoon, but I should need to close on the Wednesday so that I could travel to Clinton on the stage truck on Thursday afternoon. The fare from Jesmond was $2, whereas to arrange for a taxi to fetch me would cost $15. I should, in any case, have to have a taxi down the valley on my return on the Sunday. I found that Kamloops was about 120 miles away. It was a beautiful city, all green and gold with the fall colorings, and during my brief stay there, I was much impressed by the demeanor of the high school pupils and the fine buildings of the school in which the convention was held. During my first week at Big Bar Creek, I had asked the children to write a composition on what I hope to do when I grow up, and I had been appalled by the poverty of their ideas. Marjorie's aim was to be a cook to a man who had no one to look after him. Edgar's ambition was to serve in the store at Jesmond. Ralph had written, "When I grow up, I shall get married and have lots of kids to feed my chickens and herd my cattle." But if they had never seen a high school, of course they had no ambition to attend one. How I wished they were with me at Kamloops. On the second day of my visit, I went shopping, a forgotten delight, and bought some folk weave material in cream and brown and green to make a bedspread, and curtains to drape my hanging wardrobe and my bedroom doorway, so that I had plenty to occupy me on my return, especially as I had no machine and must do all the sewing by hand. Early in November, I was notified that the school medical officer would be visiting us on Tuesday for routine medical examinations of the school children, and to give inoculations and vaccinations to preschool-age children. He was also going to perform any necessary dental treatment. The children were quite excited at the thought of having their teeth pulled. Not one of them was afraid. Snow had fallen the previous day, but on the day of the medical examination, it had turned to slush, with mist in the atmosphere. just like an English winter day. This made driving difficult, and it was after 2 p.m. before the doctor's car arrived. I had my house snug, with kettles full of hot water on the stove, and the children went over to the doctor in turn. In school, the coming and going was likely to disorganize the timetable, so I read a story to the remains of the class. When school was over, the doctor was still busy. My kitchen was humming with activity. The nurse, dressed in sweaters and ski pants, was administering injections. Half-dressed children were spitting blood into bowls. Eyes and ears were being tested and chest sounded. The table was littered with cotton wool and dressings, and the doctor was completing medical records by the light of my paraffin lamp. I carried on with my chores of wood chopping and water carrying until the last victim went in. Minnie was the last to be examined. She had to ride 3 miles down the valley against snow flurries after 4 extractions, but when I wrapped my woolen scarf around her face, she only smiled. Since the only food my visitors had had since breakfast had been a few sandwiches and a flask of coffee, I now brought out the venison stew which I had made the previous evening, and it was voted delicious. Now that the hunting season was in full swing, I had no problem about getting fresh meat. It was against the law to sell deer flesh, and so I received gifts from the fathers and big brothers of the children, a whole shoulder of venison, for instance, or a choice dish of deer liver. When a string of horses and riders, with the pack horses roped together, went past the school, I gazed at them with as much admiration as did the children. Someone would say proudly, "There go Dad's hunters," as the procession went on down to the Fraser River, to cross by the ferry, and track game on the far side of the canyon. One Monday, Edgar came to school with a message from Alfie. How would you like to ride up to Jesmond with Edgar to fetch your mail on Wednesday evening? On horseback, I asked, thrilled. I should love it. Alfie was going to be busy with the hunters, and he wanted his mail to answer that evening before the stage truck came. He did not wish Edgar to make the long ride to Jesmond by himself, though I could not imagine what protection I should be if we met any wild animal. As soon as school was over on Wednesday afternoon, I filled my lamps and my pails while the boys chopped wood for me. Then I put on my thick clothing, wool socks, ski pants and tunic, and fur-trimmed hood, and we set off. Pete had a rattling old bicycle on which he whizzed down to school, now over the ruts and stones. There were 3 horses between the rest of us. Douglas and Dick rode together on Nigger, Douglas sitting bareback behind the saddle and holding a rope which was tied to Pete's handlebars so that they could tow him up the slope. I mounted Edgar's horse, sitting on the western saddle, while Edgar sat behind Michael had the buckskin to himself, and he set the pace. I wondered how Douglas kept his seat on the satin, slippery back of the galloping horse, and at the same time manipulated the towing rope which was hauling the bicycle. When we reached Alfie's house, Buck, Michael's horse, was allotted to me. Sacks for the groceries were put into the saddlebags, and Edgar and I, each on our own mount, set off for the steep climb to Jesmond. I was surprised to find how easy the horse was to ride. One had only to lean in the saddle, and the horse would respond, changing direction as indicated, and at the slightest tap of one's heels he would begin to lope. I had never galloped before, and I found it exhilarating. Buck seemed to enjoy it too. We soon came to snow, and Edgar casually interpreted the tracks in the dusk, saying who was ahead of us, and how long it was since they had passed that way. I kept looking back to the scene below us, where the last of the sunlight was edging with silver the tree-fringed range of mountains. In front of us, behind the black mass of the forest, one snow-capped peak stood out against a cold blue sky. There was a cheerful welcome for us at the mountain house, and I sat in the big kitchen, enjoying the conversation and reading my letters. After a supper of deer's meat and blueberry pie, we set off on the homeward journey. For the first few miles, the air was literally sparkling, as the starlight scintillated on the minute particles of frost floating in the air. The dazzling specks were so brilliant that at first I thought they were distant signal lights. Further down the mountain, the darkness was thick, but the horses knew the trail and pounded along. By the time we got back to Edgar's home, I was aching in every muscle, so I declined the offer of a horse to take me down to school, being only too thankful to walk the 3 remaining miles. A few miles beyond Clinton, in a beautiful clearing in the forest, is the Circle H Ranch, a picturesque cluster of log cabins which cater for hunters in the autumn. Philip Vaccaret came from the Circle H to stay at Big Bar Ranch for a time so that he could attend school, but as the winter approached, traveling became too difficult and he had to return home. His parents were English, and they invited me to spend Thanksgiving weekend in November at their home. Mr. Vaccaret drove by car down to fetch us after school on Friday afternoon, a distance of about 20 miles each way. The ranch buildings consisted of a semicircle of little log cabins, each containing a double-tiered bunk or a bed with wood-burning fireplace and easy chairs and accommodation for clothes. The main building was a large log cabin with a kitchen, dining room, and lounge. The dining room was at right angles to the lounge, like the top of a letter T, and the long dining table fitted into this, with the archway to the lounge behind. Bare rugs were spread on the polished spruce floors, and other skins draped the furniture. By supper time, the next day all the cabins were occupied, and there were 29 of us to sit down to the meal. As Miss Vakire had not expected such a crowd, and had no other woman to help her, she was glad to enlist my services. The hunting parties went off on horseback on Sunday morning in search of game, while Philip and I helped with the chores around the cabins. I was longing to walk in the forest, but there was so much to do that we were occupied until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had been warned not to go walking by myself, and so I asked Philip if he would be my guide. We armed ourselves with little BB guns and set off. The moss under the trees was deep and soft, and the scent of resin from the spruce trees filled the air. Philip led the way towards the swamp, and as we came near it, he motioned me to tread softly. He climbed a little hillock behind a tree, stood looking for a moment, and then whispered urgently, "Come here." I thought he had seen a squirrel, and I stepped up softly behind him and looked in the direction in which he was pointing. There, about 100 yards away, his head raised uneasily towards us, stood a bull moose, disturbed as he was drinking. We saw the black wattle and the full spread of his horns. We moved in our excitement, and he turned and lumbered off into the shadow of the pines. We started to run for home, to spread the news. Near the ranch we came upon returning hunters, tired and dejected from a day of fruitless tracking. The next afternoon, about 3:30, a couple of the hunters asked me if I would show them the way to the swamp. I said I would try, since there seemed to be no one else about. My companions wore red hats in accordance with the game laws. This is to avoid shooting accidents in the woods. I followed the same trail as the one we had taken the previous day. We came to the hillock, and I crept up to it, but when I raised my head over the top, I saw no moose, merely a circle of red hats round the swamp. Most of the hunters went home with their next few months' meat supply assured, the carcass of their victim strapped to the back of the car. The next time Philip came down to the school, I heard him telling Pete and Fred about the weekend. "What sort of a hunter is she?" asked Pete in undertones. "She's good," said Philip, and I felt really proud. By the middle of November, I was already thinking about the Christmas festivities, and I wondered if we could undertake a nativity play. Although the Manual of School Law forbade the teaching of Scripture, the tradition of opening the day with a period of Scripture teaching, which I had acquired during my years in England, was so much a part of me that I found it very difficult to forego the habit in this new environment. We recited the Lord's Prayer every morning, as permitted, and I read a passage from the Bible as prescribed, but in view of the wide age range, the passages set were sometimes unsuitable. In the September days, when the sun shone so gloriously, and the cottonwood trees along the banks of the creek or pillars of pure gold. I could not forbear to teach the children the hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful. There was no musical instrument in school, and I had to teach the hymn by voice. Ralph found this so disagreeable that he would surreptitiously put his fingers in his ears, but they picked up the tune quite creditably and seemed to enjoy singing the hymn. They were naturally musical, as they were naturally artistic. One day, after we had said the Lord's Prayer, I ventured a question. "What do we mean by heaven?" I asked. There was a pause. Then Michael said, "Heaven's the place you go to if you're good." This seemed an adequate answer, but then Ralph came in with, "And if you're bad, a man comes along with a pitchfork and sticks it into your belly and throws you into the middle of a big fire." This Victorian concept took me by surprise. I said, "Oh no, Ralph, I don't think that can be true." "Sure it's true," said Ralph. "The sisters told us." "Well, the next time you see the sisters," I said, "tell them I don't think that is true." "Not me," said Ralph. "Besides," he added, "it's the only way I can stop our Roy from swearing." Roy was 4 years old. "But wouldn't you rather have Roy stop swearing because he wanted to be good than because he was afraid of what might happen to him if he was bad?" I asked. Ralph pondered, then gave a hesitant yes. The next time I was down at Henry's place, I asked Annie about the sisters, and she told me that they came down the valley about once in 10 years, when the bishop held a confirmation. The priest was supposed to come once a year to hear confessions. I wondered if this was all the chance the children had of instruction in Christianity. Later on, in school one day, I asked them if anyone else had ever taught them about Jesus. They said, "Some people came once, a man and 2 women." "What were these people?" I asked. Michael said doubtfully, "I think they were Christians." "Well, aren't we all Christians?" I asked in astonishment. The children replied with one voice, "No, we're Catholics." The Indian families in the valley were in the charge of the Roman Catholics. I was a member of the Church of England, but I felt urgently that it devolved upon me to bring up the children to conform with Christian standards. If the Catholic priest had sought my cooperation, I would gladly have given it him, but he did not do so, and when I wrote to him on behalf of the children, he ignored my letter. He probably was much occupied with his large parish. After a time, it occurred to me that I could present the great stories of the Old and New Testament as literature, and I began to tell these. Never had I been among children who could better appreciate them. Their parents were anxious about them, as Mary and Joseph had been when they lost Jesus, owing to the danger from wild beasts. They knew only too well what happened to the seed which fell upon stony ground. They had seen the devotion of the shepherds, who brought thousands of sheep over 100 miles to pasture down their valley. For me, too, the Old and New Testament stories came alive in this environment, as they had never done before. By mid-December, the temperature outside was 18 degrees below zero. At night, when I went out of doors, I found the scene like one of those Christmas cards that children love. In the light of the moon, the sky seemed blue-gray, dotted with a few little stars. The snow was thickly powdered with diamonds, and from the black bulk of the log house, 2 golden squares of light shone out. I enjoyed the cold. The only bad moment of the day was when I first woke to see the windows thickly encrusted with my frozen breath. I would skip out of bed into the kitchen, where in not more than 3 minutes the logs would be roaring in the stove. I had found out why so many newspapers had been packed in the car. Then I returned to my blankets until the room had thawed out. By 9:30, when school was due to begin, the house would be very cozy, and the first children to arrive would come straight in to get warm. They all had to walk to school in the winter, as the horses had been turned loose on top of the range to forage for themselves. I was sorry for the little boys when they came in after their long walk, looking pinched and cold, their eyelashes white with hoarfrost, and little icicles hanging from their noses and chins. I discovered with a shock that anything containing moisture was now out of action. The beautiful new 2-gallon flagon of ink froze solid overnight, shattering the glass container and leaving a bottle-shaped lump of ink on the shelf. Paints or pottery clay that had been mixed with water just turned to rocks. For the first half hour of the day, we sat in outdoor clothing, huddled round the heater. This consisted of a sort of drum lying on its side, supported on legs, with a door at the front end. The fire was started with small strips of kindling, and then fed with long sections of logs of pine or spruce, and in a very short time it was giving out a great heat. If the outside temperature dropped more than 10 below zero, the children were not required to attend school. If none of them turned up, this meant another day of silence for me. I had few books to read, and no radio or newspapers. When Prince Charles was born, a messenger rode down from Jesmond to give me the news. The children were full of it at school the next day. Fred said, "They're going to give Princess Elizabeth an extra bottle of rum." It said so on the radio. Some of the homes had battery radios, which received the programs sent out from Kamloops. There was always so much to do, however, that I had not time to be lonely. One can be much more devastatingly alone in a flat with all modern amenities in the center of a teeming city. I experimented with cooking. The rancher had invited me to help myself to the fruit in a little orchard near the school, and I had made clear, amber-colored crab apple jelly and apple chutney. I made sponge cakes and cookies, date and nut bread with cinnamon buns. I had on occasion had to swallow some unpalatable messes, but I could at least return thanks that there was only myself to suffer them. The irrigation ditch was out of action now, of course, and I had to trek right down to the creek for water, taking the axe with me to break the ice. The waters were silent at last, locked in the grip of the ice, twigs reaching down from overhanging boughs looked as if they were embedded in crystal. You could not go out without a head covering and thick gloves. It was painful to touch the handle of the pail, or even the wooden handle of the axe, with the naked hands. A few days before the end of the term, the boys went out with axes and returned with 3 trees, 2 to stand in pails on the doorstep, and 1 for the presents inside the room. For there were to be presents. Mysterious and exciting parcels had been arriving in the mail, addressed to the children of Big Bar Creek. They were from the ladies of the Columbia chapter of the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire in Vancouver, with whom I had established a correspondence on behalf of my pupils. Every afternoon we rehearsed our play. Edgar was the reader, reading directly from the Bible a number of passages, giving continuity to the nativity scene, while the actors performed their parts in simple mime, and we connected the incidents by singing carols. They learnt about 10 carols. I thought dress would present a difficulty, but the children saw no incongruity in the pieces we managed to collect. Herod wore my green overall, and Douglas, as one of the kings, was delighted with my blue satin kimono. Michael, another king, insisted on wearing his mother's fur coat, which came down to his heels. Mary wore an old blue satin petticoat and swathes of white cheesecloth, intended for school dusters. Joseph was robed in a pink dressing gown, with a turban, and leaned on a staff. The dressing of the shepherds was simple, once I had been able to borrow sheets and blankets. Viva was the angel, supported by a heavenly host in the shape of Dick and Floyd. Annie had contrived their costumes with sheets and cheesecloth. When the night of the performance came, the room was packed. Joe had made repeated journeys with his truck up and down the mountain road until 50 people or more had gathered in the little schoolhouse. The youngest was Leela's baby, aged 10 months, and the oldest was Auntie Maggie, 83 years old, and almost blind. After an hour or so of games, one end of the room was transformed into a stable. The floor was strewn with straw, then a gray curtain was hung across the wide archway to form a back cloth, and the manger group formed a tableau in front of it, Mary sitting at the head of the crib, and Joseph standing behind, leaning on his staff. The performance was simple, but the audience found it moving. To me, the important thing was that the children were now not only familiar with the Christmas story, but were able to read it for themselves from the Bible. After the play, shepherds, crooks, and kings, crowns were laid aside, and the seats pushed back to the wall, ready for the distribution of presents. Soon the floor was littered with wrapping papers, and the air loud with exclamations of delight as the toy trucks and strings of beads and pretty handkerchiefs were revealed. Suddenly there was a shriek from Floyd, who declared he had seen a scarlet-clad figure passing the window, and the next moment the door opened to admit Santa Claus with a loaded sack. Somebody called out, "Where did you leave your reindeer, Santa?" And he replied, "Oh, I stabled them up at the OK Ranch for a rest." Then Floyd declared with wide eyes that it must be the real Santa, because Harry Marriott, who owned the OK, had told him Santa was going to stable his reindeer there. Santa Claus brought more gifts: a hunting knife for Edgar, a fountain pen for Marjorie, books and fish hooks and mechanical toys. Then Marjorie took a present off the tree for Santa Claus himself. It turned out to be a mouth organ, and he was delighted with it. However, he had to hurry on to his next party, and so we all wished him a happy Christmas, and the merriment continued. The next morning I was under cross-examination. Douglas declared Santa Claus was wearing Walter's boots, and Floyd said his beard was pinned on. At last I had to admit that Walter, little Johnny's brother, had deputized for Santa Claus, who had been held up by bad weather. The real fact was that none of the ranchers would bother to come so far to make Christmas real for the children. Chapter 5. Hitting a High Spot. I was quite excited at the thought of going home for the holidays. In response to a postcard which I had sent in the mail the previous week, the taxi driver from Clinton came to collect me at the school at about 4:30 in the afternoon, and I retraced that first journey through the forest, going downhill this time, the headlights of the car showing up the deer tracks in the snow. When we turned the last corner and the bright lights of Clinton appeared below us, I had an unexpected shock of pleasure. Civilization must mean more to me than I had thought. The little village felt like a metropolis after the dark loneliness of my mountains. At Clinton, I visited the home of the school principal, where I was hospitably received by his wife. After supper, I enjoyed the exchange of professional gossip. We discussed the children, and the principal said, "I suppose they are all in the low IQ bracket. Many of these children are unteachable." I told him that he was right in his first assumption, but that the children were all teachable, and in my opinion possessed a lively intelligence with regard to rural matters. Around midnight, I boarded the transcontinental bus bound for Vancouver, and I was so drowsy that it seemed only minutes before we were humming down the mountain towards Ashcroft. The bus zoomed along, straight for the edge of the precipice, with nothing beyond but the starlit sky, then swung round a hairpin bend, just giving the passenger time to visualize the fate that awaited him if the bus ripped through the fence and catapulted down to the Thompson River. Then suddenly came the vision of fairyland, the geometrical pattern of the street lights of Ashcroft far below, and I was wide awake, but no one whom I knew joined the bus, and I slept again until daylight. Vancouver was gay with the season's festivities. Last-minute shoppers, loaded with parcels wrapped in decorated papers and tied with gay cellophane ribbons, surged through the brilliantly lit stores. All day long, loud speakers over the store doorways amplified the carol tunes and Christmas peals from electric carillons. The big coastal steamers brought in hundreds of passengers from Alaska and northern British Columbia, all eager to enjoy the bright lights. In the streets, evergreen wreaths hung from overhead wires, and huge illuminated Christmas trees decorated the public squares, and the tiers of street lights quivered in reflection in the water below. The heavy scent of cedar boughs hung in the air, and across the inlet the black silhouette of forested mountain ranges cut a zigzag out of the skyline. My holiday was saddened by the discovery that my aunt was suffering from cancer and had not long to live. I visited her frequently in hospital and also spent 1 or 2 evenings at the cinema and the children's theater. There is no pantomime tradition there, but the performances in the children's theater were charming entertainment. I also made a point of getting in touch with the ladies of the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire who had sent presents for the children. I told them how much these had been appreciated and gave them some idea of the sort of life the children lived in the valley. They said they had tried to help a number of rural schools, but that the teachers whom they had approached had failed to reply to their letters. My own immediate friends listened open-mouthed to the stories of my adventures, but I could not understand why they all found it necessary to commiserate with me. To me, the past 3 months had brought fulfillment of the passionate desire for adventure which I had so long suppressed. In my childhood, the first school I had attended had been decorated with large lettered text and proverbs expressing worthy sentiments, such as, "Procrastination is the thief of time," "One good deed deserves another," "What we see becomes part of us." The proverb which appealed to me most, however, was, "A rolling stone gathers no moss," and when I asked my father what it meant, he interpreted it for me as meaning that a successful man does not keep on changing his job. So I had grown up ashamed of the urge within me to seek wider horizons, and had striven to conform with the laudable ideal of becoming a moss-gathering stone. At 10 years of age, my adventurous spirit had made me the most rip-roarin' cowgirl of the neighborhood. At 20, I managed to live the life of a pioneer, at least 1 week in each year, when I took my wolf cubs to camp. But by the time I was 30, I was bogged down in an industrial city, a prim and lonely schoolmarm, 7 years out of college. Teaching is an adventure in itself, of course. Every September, the teacher receives her new class. a new set of personalities to explore, a new group of minds to measure. And when I first came out of college, this professional challenge had been adventure enough. But as the years passed, and life repeated itself in a succession of arduous weekdays and solitary Sundays, I began to feel cheated of the things that mattered. I had missed the adventure of marriage, and as time went on, I became more poignantly aware that the children whom I loved were always other people's children. In the city, I was homesick for the simple delights of my country upbringing. Hemmed in by regiments of chimneys and miles of tram tracks, I chafed for the open fields and hedgerows, dazzled by the city lights and deafened by the clang of the traffic. I dreamt of starlit skies over the silent wold. But chiefly I dreamed of Canada. I longed to teach in a prairie school, with cowboys galloping round the door. I selected names like Moose Jaw and Medicine Hat, and built up fantasies around them. I did not have the slightest anticipation that my dreams would one day be realized. When I was a young teacher, I was never solvent, and my father would not have allowed me, adult though I was, to leave England unless I had a job assured. But one fateful day in 1937, when I was visiting a friend, I met a teacher who had spent a year in Canada under an exchange scheme which I had never heard of, and she urged me to follow her example. This was opportunity knocking, and I hastened to open the door. I found that the only appointment still vacant that year was for a teacher to go to Prince Rupert in British Columbia, so I borrowed on my life insurance policy enough money to buy me a one-way ticket to Vancouver, and then broke the news to my family that I was going to Canada. After the storm had subsided, my father handsomely augmented my traveling fund, and I soon found myself embarking on a cargo liner for Montreal. At first, Canada disappointed me. There was so much of it. I looked in vain for cowboys galloping beside the track, and as we approached the Rockies, for wild animals emerging from the forest. When we came to Banff, I left the train to stay overnight, but as I had no contacts there, I set out to explore by myself. There was beautiful Indian handicraft in the shops. There were also some attractive campfire blankets, but I was disappointed to find them labeled "Made in England." Leaving the town, I followed a trail through the woods. I paused to admire a group of log buildings set back among the pine trees about 100 yards away. As I was gazing, a glossy black bear ambled out from the shadows under the trees, overturned the dust bin with a flick of his paw, and shouldered his way into it. My blood raced. This was the sort of thing I had come to Canada to see. I decided that he must be a tame bear. Nobody would be so stupid as to keep a wild bear in his backyard. I longed to stroke him. Walking across the space between us, my footfall deadened by the carpet of pine needles. I stopped a few feet away from him. I pursed my lips and made the sort of noise you make to a dog. The bear leapt out of his bin backwards and sat up on his haunches, glaring at me, with cabbage leaves dangling from the corners of his mouth. He looked like a glossy black teddy bear. I held out my hand and was going to take a step towards him, but I hesitated. Some sixth sense indicated to me that he was about to strike. At the same moment, a sudden scream from the gate startled me into panic, and I ran blindly for the road. When I looked back, I saw that the bear had returned to his supper. The angry passers-by greeted me with, "Are you crazy?" And I learnt that I had been trying to make friends with a fierce she-bear from the mountains. They pointed upwards, and I saw 3 furry balls clinging to the top of a tall pine tree and watching Mama as she foraged in the garbage. My year on exchange was over all too soon. I returned to England in the autumn of 1938, and the next year war broke out. With a desperate longing to help win the war, I joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in September 1939 and served continuously for 6 years, joining up as a private and achieving the rank of subaltern after a time. I took the precaution before my release of undergoing a medical examination to receive an immigrant's medical card in case I should ever be able to return to Canada. But this possibility seemed very remote now. My parents were old and needed me, and I could not be happy if I felt I had let them down. So, in 1945, I returned to my first love, the teaching profession, and prepared to gather moss. I found that educational methods had changed during my 6 years away from the profession, and I needed a refresher course. I spent a wonderful year at the London University Institute of Education from 1947 through 48. Then suddenly, the plans I had made for a humdrum life collapsed like a pack of cards. My mother had died, and my father insisted on living alone, and I could return to Canada. After weathering the manifold frustrations of those days, the difficulty of obtaining a passage, a passport, a Bank of England authority, fortified by faith, and a purse containing $40, I set out on my journey to Vancouver, to the home of my mother's brother, her sole surviving relative. When I arrived, I found that my aunt had been in hospital for years, but her friend, in whose home my uncle lived, made me very welcome and gave me the freedom of her house until I should find a job. If the number of the advertisements for teachers wanted was any indication, I should have little difficulty in finding a teaching post. The daily papers were full of them, but first I must find out whether or not my qualifications were acceptable. My hostess said indignantly, "Of course your qualifications will be accepted." She was English herself, but I knew that the professions in British Columbia very rightly protected their own members by demanding certain conditions of outsiders who entered the province and wished to practice their profession. Perhaps I should be required to attend a Canadian university before being allowed to teach in Canada. I wrote to the British Columbia Department of Education in Victoria on Vancouver Island and was invited to attend for interview. Before leaving England, I had asked the Ministry of Education to send a note of my professional qualifications direct to Victoria, and I was glad to find, when I went for interview, that I had been awarded a first-class certificate to teach in BC for a period of up to 2 years, after which I must attend a course of study in Canadian methods of teaching at a summer school of the University of British Columbia. It now remained for me to choose my job and apply for it. I sat on the shady veranda of my new home, with newspapers strewn around me. Uncle, I would call out from time to time, "Where is Lillooet, or Salmon Arm, or Alert Bay?" And Uncle would come to the door and give it as his opinion that it was in some neck of the woods, and ask why I could not take a job in Vancouver like a civilized human being. "I've come here to get away from civilization," I would say. "I want to listen to the wolves howling, to the northern lights for a change." Suddenly, a name leapt out at me. "Teacher wanted," the advertisement ran, "in the rural school of Big Bar Creek. 12 pupils. Salary according to scale." Big Bar Creek. I had a fascinating mental picture. "Uncle, does bar mean bear? They want a teacher at Big Bar Creek. Where is it?" Uncle appeared in the doorway, filling his pipe. "Well, if it does," he said, answering my first question, "I wouldn't go within miles of the place. I guess it's somewhere up in the Kootenays." We got out a map of BC and finally located Big Bar Creek in the Caribou, west of Clinton, running down to the Fraser River. I wrote a letter of application and posted it that evening, stating that my qualifications in detail and appending copies of testimonials, as one always does in England. I had yet to learn that testimonials are seldom called for in Canada. In the teaching profession, appointments are made on the strength of the inspector's report, which is used at the end of the year after he has made his inspection. A typed copy of it is mailed to the teacher. 2 days later, we were having breakfast when the phone rang. Lucy, my hostess, answered it. After a moment, she looked at me and said, "Long distance for you." "For me?" I exclaimed. Who in Canada could be calling me? I took the receiver and said, "Hello." "This is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Ashcroft School Board," said a man's voice, "with regard to your application for the school at Big Bar Creek. Can you get here by the end of the week?" "Well, yes," I stammered, "but don't you, I think you will like the children," the voice went on. "They're a sturdy frontier type." "Yes, of course," I said, "but don't you want to interview me?" "Oh, that's all right," the speaker replied. "We think you are what we want. We prefer an older teacher because the post is somewhat isolated. Will expect you here on Friday. Then goodbye." I hung up the receiver, and when I had recovered my breath, I said, "I've got it." "Got what?" said Uncle. "The school at Big Bar Creek." "You're crazy," he commented. I visited the hospital to tell my aunt the news. She looked at me wistfully and said, "We shan't be seeing much of you then." On the following Thursday night, I boarded the long-distance bus going eastwards, and that was how it had all begun. Now I would not have changed my secluded valley for all the neon lights in Canada, but I don't think anyone believed me when I said so. I left Vancouver to return to my valley on the last day of December, traveling this time by train as far as Ashcroft, where I was to stay overnight, going on to Clinton by bus the next day. I had booked a room in the hotel there, which was lucky, as the place seemed to be surprisingly full of people. About 6 o'clock in the evening, I rang up the doctor with a query about one of my pupils. During the conversation, he apologized that he could not ask me over to his home to spend the evening, as he was taking his wife out to dinner. He hesitated a moment, and then asked a strange question. "Have you got a formal with you?" he said. "A formal?" I asked. "Yes, long skirts," he said. "Well, how did you guess?" I said. "It so happens that I have." I had brought back with me some of the things I had previously left behind at my uncle's house. "Hold on a minute," said the doctor. "I'll ring you back." I hung up the receiver, wondering what this mysterious conversation presaged. After a few minutes, the phone bell rang. I picked up the receiver. "Get on your glad rags," said the doctor. "I'll be round to pick you up at 7 o'clock. Don't eat any dinner. You're going to a party." "A party?" I said, bewildered. "Sure thing," he replied. "It's New Year's Eve, you know." I rushed back to my room, feverishly threw everything out of my case, and persuaded the hotel management to allow me to use the laundry room to press my frock. I was duly buttoned up and powdering my nose when there came a knock at my door. "Come in," I called, and the doctor walked in. "Wow," he said, raising his eyebrows. "Will I do?" I asked. "And how?" he said, walking round me to get the full effect. It was rather a nice evening dress of periwinkle blue lace, cut low in the bodice over a full-skirted blue satin foundation. But if anyone had told me I should take it out of mothballs to disport in this cowboy town, this neck of the woods, as my uncle would have called it, I should have been quite incredulous. Unexpected treats are always the greatest fun, and I swished past the revelers in the hotel entrance hall with an anticipatory glow in my heart. It turned out to be the most amazing and vivacious party I had ever attended. The guests, all correctly attired, met in an Ashcroft home, a large bungalow-type house with pleasant rooms opening onto a central corridor. We chatted in the dimly lit, comfortable drawing room for a time while drinks circulated, and then, at the suggestion of our hostess, grouped informally in 4 round, low tables. Then we filed out of one door, across the corridor, into the dining room, out by another door, and back into the drawing room, on the way collecting serviettes, plates, and cutlery, and then our choice of the most delectable dishes laid out on the table: cold turkey, chicken, beef, ham, with all the etceteras, cranberry jelly, bread sauce, stuffing, olives, salads, and mayonnaise. Back in the drawing room, we disposed of the feast picnic fashion, round or coffee tables. Then we made a second procession to deposit the empties and collect ice cream desserts, fruit and coffee. Our host and hostess literally kept open house. There were so many comings and goings that I began to feel dizzy. Some of the younger ones drifted off in couples to the dance in town, and the rest of us set to work on the washing up. This was a corporate effort, shared by men and women, some people operating as washers or dryers, and the others forming a chain along which the dishes were passed to their places in the various cupboards. The house began to fill up again. I wondered if it was because the dance was not a success. I knew I could not hope to remember the names of the people whom I had met, or even whether I had met them or not. A big man bore down on me and took me by the waist. "Come with me," he said, and he drew me through the throng into the corridor, past the dining room, where late comers were cleaning up the buffet dishes, and into the kitchen. The crowd in here was even thicker. The young couples were back again, sharing stools, by the simple expedient of sitting on each other's knees, or propping up the wall. Suddenly, above the noise of the party, was heard the triumphant pealing of bells from the radio. The new year was coming in. Everyone went mad. The men kissed the women, and the women kissed each other. The men progressed round the room, kissing every hopeful-looking woman they met. The whiskey glasses were raised aloft, and the new year was uproariously welcomed. Then we all bundled into cars and went over to the dance, which was a seething mob of Indians and cowboys and nondescripts like us. We gyrated as rhythmically as possible under the circumstances, until the crush became too great. Then the doctor and his wife and my escort and I returned to the deserted bungalow, where we sat and chatted and ate sandwiches and drank coffee until the small hours. We did some more washing up. My new friend kept insisting that he was not scared of school teachers, and to prove it, he gave me 1 or 2 admonitory slaps. Then our host and hostess returned, and the doctor took me back to the hotel to spend what was left of the night in bed. The next morning, before I caught the bus to Clinton, I had a visitor, a sober and somewhat sheepish-looking visitor. He said his wife had sent him to apologize, in that you weren't supposed to slap the school teacher, at any rate, not on the posterior. He was assured that it had been a pleasure. Chapter 6. Making the Teacher Get Mad. In the first week of January, a warm Chinook wind arrived strangely before time. The children could play out of doors, without jackets, and in a couple of days the snow had disappeared. But then we woke up the next morning to find the snow was a foot deep, and the weather became very cold, so cold that my dish mop, which hung from a nail on the logs inside the house, was frozen solid every time I came to use it, and even the pails standing near the stove were always covered with a layer of ice. This was because eddies of cold air filtered through the chinks between the logs, yet the room itself was beautifully warm. There was no question of sitting huddled over the fire as one does in an English house in winter. One Saturday afternoon I carried a pail of hot water over to the school, intending to clean all the blackboards, but the moment my cloth touched the cold surface, there was a film of ice on the board, and I could neither get it off nor write on top of it. One day Pete came to school, accompanied by a hound dog. This was an English pointer, which had been left behind by the hunters because it was gun-shy. He was such a wretched bag of bones that it broke my heart to look at him. Indians seem to expect a dog to do its own foraging, and Freckles was not used to that. He had probably been brought up in kennels, where everything was done for him. When Pete asked me if I would like to buy the dog, I assumed that he could not afford to keep him, so I said I would not buy him. He could remain Pete's dog, but I would gladly give him a home until the spring. So I had a companion at last, a long-eared, bloodshot-eyed, sentimental hunk of dog that went gallivanting ahead of me when I took my pails down to the creek in the mornings and chased the squirrels up the trees near and far. He was soon eating me out of house and home, but I appreciated having something to talk to. He obviously had some internal complaint, drinking pints of water at a time. This term I had a new pupil, Marjorie's elder sister Dolly, who had left school the previous June and been working in Clinton, was now back in the valley, and the children said she was crazy to come back to school. So I invited her to come and see me. She was a pretty girl, with a broad brow and black curls hanging below her cowgirl hat. She had completed the grade 8 studies, and grade 9, which ranks as junior high school, is not allowed in rural schools without special permission from the inspector. She was intelligent, like the rest of the family, and I decided that I could give her a course in typing, which would stand her in good stead. So while awaiting the inspector's recommendations, I set her to work with my manual of typing and allowing her to use my own precious typewriter, working by herself in my house. She came every afternoon for 2 or 3 weeks and was doing very well. Then one day she failed to turn up. I asked Marjorie where she was. "She's quit," said Marjorie. There was no apology implied. "Why?" I asked. "Dad's sent her up the mountain. Presumably she was going to be someone's cook." I was rather taken aback by this incident, and at the first opportunity I discussed it with the school trustee. "They're like that," he said. "You can't change them." That was the consensus of opinion among the white people in the valley. They're a bad bunch of kids. You can't change them. Anyone who had had experience of juvenile delinquency in industrial areas would recognize that these children were a very fine group of country children whose deficiencies were due to lack of opportunity, particularly the opportunity of contact with the right example. If they were to change, they must first have a model. I knew it was up to me to provide this model. The children had a poor opinion of my educational methods. They considered I was not a proper teacher and did not hesitate to say so. This was probably because I did not require them to sit in rows and work to a rigid timetable and put up a hand when they wanted to make a remark. The most important thing, I felt, was to give them confidence in the use of English. Reading was important, and discrimination with regard to what they read would be developed in proportion to the practice they had in writing. But they would never learn to write freely through lessons on the construction of a sentence or the nature of a paragraph. The value of that sort of teaching would come later still, involving underlining adjectives or deciding whether a statement was true or false. They would only be able to write if they knew they had something to say that other people would be interested to hear, and that was the approach I emphasized. I told them they had more to write about than anyone I had ever met. That life in their valley, though it might seem dull to them, was full of incidents that would spell glamour to a city boy. I invited them to record, each day, anything of interest that had happened at home or on the way to school. From these accounts, which they made in their scribblers, I selected items which they rewrote neatly and illustrated with their own drawings to form a nature diary. This was hard labor at first, especially to Douglas and Arthur, who could not write the words they wanted to use, so that I had to make a copy for them. Even Marjorie, at the top of the school in September 1948, could produce no more than a few lines. We found a garter snake over by the teacher's house. We put him in a pan full of water. He could swim. When we would touch him on the head, he would put out his forked tongue. The following year, her first composition read as follows. This year, Dad got a contract from Mr. Marriott to put up the wild meadow hay on halves, taking half the crop as payment for his labor. The hay had not been put up for 3 or 4 years, so it was hard to cut, but there was a lot of old hay lying about flat on the ground that would get caught up in the cogs. First of all, you need to cut the hay with a mowing machine, then let it lie flat until it dries. It took about 4 days to cut at the first camp. The next thing to be done is to rake the hay in windrows, then bunch it. Almost any other hayers would then shock the hay, but Dad said we would not have time. You shock the hay with a pitchfork. It makes it easier to haul. When they had enough hay raked, we started hauling. To haul hay, you use a team and sloop. The more sloops, the better. If there is also a team for the derrick, it saves unhooking the team of the sloop onto the cable. It takes one man to drive the derrick and one to trip the load after it gets on top of the stack. The stacker has to stay on top of the stack and straighten off the top after every load. Swamp hay is the hardest to stack. You have to move every straw. When you get the stack high enough, you have to top it off, then put some poles to hold it down. If you put the hay up too wet, it will burn, and what does not will go black, and no animal will eat it. So putting up hay is not so easy as you might think. It seemed to me that nature study was more important as a subject on the curriculum than science for these children. Nature study not from books so much as from the environment, supplemented by reference to books. They could not name more than 2 or 3 of the wild flowers that grew on the mountains: brown-eyed Susans, violets, and bluebells. These last were little blue campanulas that in spring spread over the slopes in waves of purple. All the rest they dismissed as weeds. I sent to Vancouver for illustrated flower books from which they could identify and label their specimens, and we kept a nature table stocked with our finds. We caught a water beetle, the biggest I had ever seen, and kept it in a bowl on the table. Then one lunchtime the children came running with a bucket containing a still more monstrous beetle, 3 inches long, with corresponding girth. It made a meal of the smaller one overnight. I had received my first direct challenge before this time in the matter of discipline. I would not tolerate the chewing of gum in school, since I knew that this led to the objectionable habit of parking gum on the underside of the furniture. One morning I saw Douglas with his jaws moving, so I said, "Douglas, are you chewing gum?" Douglas smiled and said, "Yes." "Get rid of it," I said firmly. Douglas took the gum out of his mouth, went over to the stove, kicked open the door. The knob was too hot to touch with the hand, and I supposed threw the wad of gum into the fire. He returned to his place. A few minutes later, I saw that his jaws were working again. "Douglas," I said sternly, "what did you do with that gum?" "I put it back into my mouth," said Douglas. This called for drastic action. "Go over to my house," I said. The strap provided by the school board in confirmation with the requirements of the Manual of School Law had disappeared before my arrival. My predecessor had used it. It could guess what had happened to it. I walked slowly across to my house, debating as to what action I should take. Douglas was waiting on the doorstep. I opened the door. "Come inside," I said. "Now I gave you an order, and you did not obey me. You have to obey the teacher, so I am going to punish you." Just then my glance fell on my dish mop, hanging on the kitchen wall. My problem was solved. "Hold out your hand," I said. He did so, and I took him firmly by the wrist and administered 3 sharp cuts with the handle of the dish mop. I gave him a moment to compose his features, and then sent him back to school. so my dish mop remained the instrument of correction throughout my stay in the valley, and the children developed a healthy respect for it. One evening, when 2 of the older boys were chatting in my house, one of them leaned back and drawled, "Say, teacher, hear you use the dish mop when the kids give you trouble." "Yes, I do," I replied. "Well, I guess that don't hurt much," they said. "Would you like to try it?" I asked, and they replied, "Sure," and held out their hands. I used the mop to good effect, and there were no more jokes about it, at least not in my hearing. But it became a cause of resentment among the boys that I did not use the mop on the girls. "Why don't you lick Marjorie?" they asked. "She deserves it too." "I will give Marjorie a different punishment," I said. But the boys were insistent that I should lick the girls. "Fred used to," they said. "Nonsense," said I, but they all agreed about this. "What was she punished for?" I asked. The children grinned. "She was teasing him," they said. "What about?" I asked. Ralph laughed. "About the whiskey under his bed," he replied. Then I realized that they enjoyed making the teacher get mad and were prepared to risk a licking in doing so. One night, when the outside temperature was well below 0, I was sitting marking books very late, except for the occasional faint plop of a piece of wood ash falling from my stove. There was complete silence. Suddenly, an ear-splitting crash on the wall just behind my head made my heart nearly jump out of my body. I dared not move, but sat fighting for composure, wondering how many pairs of eyes were centered on my unscreened windows. After casually turning pages for a few seconds, I got up and walked to the door and slipped the bolt. Then I went through the curtained doorway into the darkness of my bedroom to recover. The next morning I described the incident to the children, and they laughed and told me that such sounds often occurred in the extreme cold, and it was due to the contraction of the logs. A couple of weeks later, I was busy ironing one night when there was a sudden crash on the roof. There came another report, and another, but I was not startled this time. I opened the door and called out, "Who's out there playing tricks? Come along in and have a cup of coffee." After a long pause, I heard approaching footsteps, and Pete and Fred appeared, both looking a bit foolish. "We thought you'd get mad," they said. Some weeks later, on a night when there was brilliant moonlight outside, with consequent black shadows around the house, there came a bang on the wall, followed by a succession of crashes which shook the house. "That will be Pete and Fred with time on their hands," I said to myself. "I shall have to organize another dance." I opened the door and called out into the shadows, "All right, you two, stop fooling and come and have some coffee." I left the door ajar and went back into the house. A minute later, a stone came hurtling through the window. This was discouraging. I had not thought there was that sort of a relationship between us. But firm action was needed. "That is enough," I called out. "I will deal with this in the morning." But to my consternation, The noises went on, lumps of wood and stone being thrown onto the roof and walls of the house from all directions. I remembered a story I had been told about another isolated school in the same school district. An older woman teacher had been newly appointed, and one night the children had set out to torment her, lying on an overhanging rock and dropping stones on her house from above. The poor soul had been so frightened that she had stood all night pressed against the wall between two windows, and she had suffered a nervous breakdown afterwards. Well, they certainly would not get that sort of a reaction from me. When the crashes were coming thick and fast on the back of the house, I stepped out of the door at the front and closed it quietly behind me. Standing in the black shadow on the step, I strained my eyes to see if there was any movement in the bushes or behind the wood pile, but the shadows were too thick. After a few minutes I heard undertones on my right, and then two figures ran across the sage, 20 or 30 yards away. One stooped to pick up a stone, and I called out, "All right, Pete and Fred, I've seen you." They fled like a pair of rabbits. A quarter of an hour later, the crashes began again, and they went on until I had had more than enough. I decided that I must fetch someone to deal with the matter, although I was loath to leave the house untended. The miscreants seemed to be in a vicious mood. I put out all the lights so that it might appear that I had gone to bed, then dressed in warm outdoor clothing and slipped out of the door again. As I opened the door, I was just in time to see 3 figures scamper off through the sage. Who could the third one be? I walked down toward Henry's, enjoying the beauty of the night. The northern lights lit up the sky like batteries of searchlights in a ring behind the mountains. When I came to Henry's, there was a saddle horse tied to the fence. If only I had not been a dumb city dweller, this would have told me all I needed to know, but I could not identify by their horses yet. The house was in darkness, and the inhabitants apparently fast asleep. The dogs, recognizing me, made no commotion. I must go on further, hoping that Joe and Lila would still be up. But when I came to Joe's house, I found that the thick shadow of the mountain lay over it, and I could not find my way in through the fence. The dogs created a great deal of noise, but no one looked out, so I assumed the house was empty. The next house was old Johnny's, a couple of miles further on, and I decided to return to my cabin. I was walking slowly up the valley when I became aware of a horse standing in the path about 100 yards in front of me. I stopped. The horse stood there like an apparition in a haze of silvery mist, and while I was trying to discern whether or not there was a rider on it, it turned up the mountain and vanished like a black velvet-footed ghost. I still stood there, and then I heard hoof beats behind me, pounding down the earth road. Fred was the only pupil who lived in that direction, so I called again. "All right, Fred, I've seen you." When I came to Henry's house, the saddle horse had gone. I anticipated that there would be some absentees the next morning, but I was wrong. As I washed up my breakfast dishes, I counted the full complement playing outside the school. I went across and assembled them in school, and then addressed them coldly. "Take out your English books," I said. "You will write composition on what I did last night. You will all write on the same subject. I want a detailed account of everything you did, from the moment you left school until you went to bed." All the time I was searching faces for any sign of consciousness of guilt, but I drew blank. Fred and Pete were as composed as usual. The others merely looked a little anxious at the coldness of my manner. I went on. "I wish to talk to each one of you separately. Pete, you will be first. Go across to my house. Marjorie, you are in charge here. No one will move out of his place until I call for him." I followed Pete out in a hushed silence. I put Pete to sit down facing the light, and I opened the interview. "Well, what have you to say?" I asked sternly. "What about?" said Pete. His face was like a mask. "About last night." "Last night?" "Yes. I want to know how you spent it." "Why? Just like any other night." "Where did you sleep?" I asked. There was a momentary pause. Pete had been staying at Joe's house, I knew. "At Fred's." "I thought you were staying at Joe's." "I was, but Joe and Lila took some cattle up the mountain yesterday." "So you slept at Fred's?" "Yes." I looked at him searchingly. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yes." "What time did you go to bed?" "About 10 o'clock. "What were you doing between 9 and 10? Cecil was showing me how to play the guitar." I was not satisfied with these answers, but Pete was so poker-faced that it did not appear that I should get any more out of him. "Very well," I said. "Stand there." I left him standing by the wall and went over to school to fetch Fred. Not a word was spoken, but 10 pairs of eyes followed me as I went down the room. I decided to be more direct with Fred. "Why did you come throwing stones at my house last night?" I asked. "I did not," said Fred. "You did. I saw you. I spoke to you." "Not to me." Fred's eyes, too, were veiled, and his expression impassive. "Yes, to you. You were riding down towards Joe's." "I was not," said Fred. "What time did you go to bed?" "About 10, I guess." "Where was Pete?" At Joe's." "I think he was at your house," I said. "No, he's staying at Joe's." "But he spent last night at your house," I insisted. Pete began to interpose a remark, but I silenced him. "No," said Fred. "Where did he sleep?" "I dunno." "Are you sure?" "Yes." I looked inquiringly at Pete, who began to stammer something to the effect that he had stayed at Fred's a couple of nights ago. It was pretty obvious that Pete was involved. "Fred," I said, "some boys from this school were throwing stones at my house last night. I want you to tell me what you know about it." "I don't know anything about it." "Is that the truth?" "Yes." I pondered. If Pete was the ringleader, who were his confederates? It was very questionable whether the little Higginbottoms would walk so far at night just to throw stones. Henry's family were not allowed out after dark. Minnie and Arthur were very unlikely culprits. I put Fred beside Pete and went and fetched the others one by one. Marjorie knew nothing about it, nor did Ralph or Viva or Floyd. Arthur and Minnie looked quite startled, so I ruled them out. I suspected Michael because I knew that he liked to play tricks, but he scorned the suggestion that he would take part in such a silly scheme. Douglas and Dick sturdily denied any knowledge of the attack, and Edgar, though he giggled a little, was equally emphatic. I sent all back to school. After the morning break, I addressed them all together, and described exactly what had happened, inviting each one of them individually to tell me what part he took in the affair. No one knew anything about it. I continued, "Very well, this much is certain. There are 3 children in this valley who are cowards. No matter how brave they may be at riding a bucking horse or stalking a moose, they are nevertheless cowards." Pete was sitting up straight and gazing at me fixedly. "Cowards," said Fred. "Yes, of course," I replied. "They chose to attack me because I was a woman, and they knew there was no danger of me being able to catch them and give them a licking. If I had been a man, or if I had had a husband, or even a near neighbor, they would not have attempted it. That is one reason why I know they are cowards. But there is another reason too. They could put things right by owning up. That needs courage of a different sort. But they have not got that either. They are still afraid of punishment. That is why I know they are cowards." Pete's gaze had never wavered. I now dismissed the subject and resumed my cordial relationship with them, but I secretly hoped that I might have touched a chord somewhere that would result in a confession. The next day, while I was having my lunch, there came a knock at my door. "Come in," I called. Pete entered, looking rather subdued. He held in his hand a broken ruler. "Hello, Pete," I said. "What's happened?" "I broke the ruler," Pete replied. "How did you do that?" I asked. "I was levering up a nail." Pete looked at the piece of cardboard in my window frame and said in a low voice, "But I did not break your window." I saw in a flash what he was trying to tell me. "You did throw stones, though?" I asked. He nodded. "You and Fred?" I asked. Pete was silent. "I suppose Michael was the third," I went on. But Pete said quickly, "No, it was not anyone from the school." Then I understood. A young lad who had been in trouble with the police in town had been sent out to the valley, and Henry had undertaken to keep an eye on him. It was this young fellow, with his grudge against society, who had been the ringleader. So Fred had ridden up to Henry's during the evening, and the 3 of them had embarked on this little expedition to make the teacher get mad, Fred leaving his horse tied to the fence. Without any suggestion from me, Pete brought money to pay for the broken window, and we had a conference to decide on further punishment. I told the 2 boys that since they were too big to be licked, they would have to pay for their fun in some other way, and in the end it was decided that they should chop wood and carry water for me whenever I wanted it during the day, from then until the end of the term. I often gave wood chopping as a punishment. It was a constructive penalty, building up a wood pile for the school heater, and at the same time enabling a boy to get rid of his feelings of aggression. The next time the rancher, who was school trustee, went past the school in his car, I signaled to him to stop. I told him the whole story, and he visited the parents and told them that the children would not have a teacher the next year if they did not behave themselves. One morning in February, Fred came to school with exciting news. There were fresh cougar tracks crossing the road just below Henry's place. Hector had seen them in the moonlight on the previous night, and Walter had gone off at first light with Benny, his dog, to track the beast. A cougar is a mountain lion, like a puma, and I thought privately that Fred's story was a bit of schoolboy sensationalism. But in the afternoon we went for a nature walk, to see any tracks there might be. I shall never forget the thrill I had when we came upon them. A cloudless cobalt sky rested on top of the dazzling white mountain ranges. The tracks were deep cut in the virgin snow from the top of one range, down over the road, across the creek, on a bridge of ice, and up the opposite slope, till we lost them among the trees. Freckles, the pointer, was with us, and as soon as we came to the tracks, he put his nose down and was off like an arrow from a bow, and in the first excitement we went streaming after him. The children were far ahead of me, of course, and they called out their interpretation of the story in the tracks which they could see across the valley. See, the coyote tracks trailing her, they called. See where she nearly slipped into the gulch. The next morning at breakfast time, the children invaded my cabin with cries of "Walter got the cougar," and "Bill's caught a bobcat." So I postponed school work and decided that we would go out for some first-hand nature study. The cougar was to be skinned that morning, so we set off at once for the 3-mile walk down the valley. When we arrived at Old Johnny's, we found that Cecil and Walter had just begun the skinning process. The big cat hung from a beam, looking wicked even in death. I admired her smooth, tawny skin, and the big, black, velvety paws, with their ferocious-looking claws. I asked Walter to tell me the story of the kill. Today was his 22nd birthday, and the bounty of $40, which the government paid for the slaughter of a cougar, owing to the amount of damage they do among the herds on the range, would make an acceptable birthday present. Whenever I had read magazine stories of cougar hunts, they had concerned a hunting party of numbers of men and hounds, and I could not believe that this young man had tackled the problem alone. Walter, accompanied by his black retriever, Benny, had gone out on horseback, following the tracks of the cougar over the bridge of ice and up the saddle horse trail till he came to the wild horse corral. Here there was the carcass of a cow. He saw from the tracks that the cougar had put her feet on the cow's back to smell the carcass. Then she had gone on up the mountainside till she came to a cave, in which she had spent the night. The next day, that was yesterday, she had gone up to Deer Spring, and walked round the knolls till she came to a cliff. Walter circled the cliff, but found no more tracks, so he whispered to Benny, "Seek 'em," and the dog leapt over the cliff, found the cougar asleep in the sunshine, and sank his teeth in her flank. She woke, began to run down the mountain, and then turned and tackled the dog. She seized him by the throat and began to shake him like a rat. Benny squealed, but Walter dare not shoot at first for fear of killing the dog. Then, seeing that Benny was choking, he shot, hitting the cougar in the head. She fell on top of Benny, who struggled out from under her and went tearing down the mountainside, half crazy. The cougar got up on her front legs, and Walter shot again. Benny now came running back, and seeing the cougar's legs twitching, pluckily sprang to the attack again, but she was dead. Then Walter had to haul her onto his saddle and make the long journey home. While the children watched the skinning, I went indoors to talk to Melanie. When I came out again, they said, "Look at Freckles." I looked at him, and my jaw dropped. "What on earth have you been doing?" I said. Freckles' stomach looked like a sack stuffed with cotton wadding. The boys had been cutting off lumps of cougar meat and throwing them to the dog. They said he had eaten about 12 pounds. Freckles certainly feasted royally for days. My pans were full of stewing cougar meat, and it smelt very good too. I bought the handsome skin from Walter for $5 and sent it to Vancouver to be mounted as a rug. Soon it adorned the polished floor in the bedroom of my log cabin. February 14th, the feast of St. Valentine, like Halloween, is a popular Canadian festival, but I felt that this occasion called for a party for the grown-ups. I asked the children if their big brothers and sisters would like to come to a dance in the schoolhouse, and they said, "Sure, we'll come too." I said, "No, this will be too late. You must go to bed." But they insisted, as they had done before, that any function in the school would be attended by the whole population in the valley. So they wrote invitations again, and we spent another afternoon spring cleaning. It was more difficult this time because the water froze in the pails on the way from the creek, and after we had heated it, we had no sooner poured it on the floor than it froze again and stuck to the mop. However, we managed to make everything spick and span, and after we had decorated the room with Victorian silhouettes and pierced hearts and cupids and lovers' knots, and the glow from the stove was reflected in the polished desks, the room looked very cozy and inviting. It gave promise of being a lovely night. About 5 o'clock, I went across to take some dishes into the school, and when I came out again, I held my breath. At the top end of the valley, where the two mountain ranges seemed to meet, the moon was rising like a great golden platter out of a dove-gray sea. A few moments later, The gray was lavender, and the lemon-colored moon was encircled by a wide, hazy, lemon-colored halo. The snow-covered mountains were dyed pink from the afterglow at the lower end of the valley, where the sky was filled with pink and copper-gilded little clouds. Later on, when the silver moon was riding high, I stood there again, feeling as though I was part of a scene from a Grimm's fairy tale. A sleigh-load of people was coming up the valley, singing to the accompaniment of the bells on the horse's harness and the strains of melody from Cecil's guitar. When they arrived, the babies were lifted down like little cocoons and put to sleep in their blankets on the carpenter's bench at the back of the school. Soon the musicians were strumming and the room was awhirl. This was not an occasion for the wearing of the blue lace frock, of course. Stetsons and gay neckerchiefs were the vogue, with check shirts and jeans, or flared skirts to rotate like spinning tops in the everybody swing movement of the square dances. The day before, in school, the children had asked me, "What shall you do if they bring liquor?" And I, unaware that there is a strict law against liquor at dances, replied, "They can bring liquor if they like. They are grown up. But if anyone is less than a gentleman, he will not be asked back." I told them to explain to their parents that this was a school and not a dance hall, and that behavior must be circumspect. But I was not worried this time. I had found a natural courtesy among the people of the valley, even though it might be sometimes roughly expressed. The orchestra consisted of 2 fiddles and a guitar. Ernest was a fine fiddler, who could throw his bow up into the air and catch it without interrupting the rhythm of the piece he was playing. Blind Uncle John also played the fiddle with abandon, and Cecil and Walter took turns at playing the guitar. Men were in the majority. The only partners available for them, at first, were the 3 schoolgirls, and myself and Melanie, but we all danced vigorously, making the floorboards rock, while Ernest called the figures in an almost unintelligible jargon. It sounded something like "Birdie in the cage and birdie in the air, swing your honey and I don't care, take your honey to a nice soft chair, take your honey any old where." As the night wore on, more dancers arrived, including Jack and Manny. I now met for the first time the man for whom the children had built the annex to my house. Jack was a slim young fellow in a black cowboy outfit, wearing a black hat with a narrow white strap round it. Manny was very tall and slim, with an expression of perpetual astonishment, owing to the fact that his eyes bulged somewhat. These 2 behaved in a rather peculiar way, and as we made the circle in the grand chain, I gazed at them searchingly. Manny gave me a limp hand and gazed back, looking somewhat apprehensive. After that dance, Manny went out, and I did not see him again. It never occurred to me that bottles of home brew had been cached among the hay in the loft in the school barn. Jack sat strumming on the guitar and singing and lapsing into giggles. A group of the children gathered round him, so at last I went to Ernest, who was MC, and told him to ask Jack to sober up or go home. Ernest said, "Oh, let's give him a little time." But when after the next dance Jack was still staggering about, I went across the room and sat beside him. I could not have drunkenness inside the school. I said, "Jack, will you come across to my house and have a talk with me?" "Why, sure," said Jack obligingly. As we went out of the door, Cecil and young Alfie tagged along behind. I was not sure whether they were constituting themselves as a bodyguard for me or for Jack. The two boys stood with their long legs backed up to my stove as I told Jack my objection to his condition. "This is not a public dance hall," I said. "It is a school, and nothing must go on in it which is not the right example to the young." This was something which needed to be said. Jack was very polite. He had been brought up in a Roman Catholic mission and knew how to behave. He said, "These children are used to drunkenness. They see it every day of their lives." I asked him if he was content to be drunk, and he hung his head a little. "Did you have a hero when you were a boy?" I asked. "I surely did," said Jack, and he told me about his hero. "Did you not model your conduct on his?" I asked. "Yes, I did," he replied. "Well," I said, "you are a hero to these boys. Give them the finest model you possibly can. Give them something to copy that is the best you are capable of." I offered him some strong coffee, and we went back to the dance, which continued till 5 a.m. By this time, most of the children were sprawled across the desks, fast asleep, and I felt utterly exhausted, but everyone else seemed as fresh as ever. A few days after the dance, something happened which depressed and perplexed me. Freckles was now an accepted member of my household, and since during the mornings, when I was in school, the fire in my house would go out, I used to let Freckles come over to school and lie at the back of the room. One day, just before afternoon school, Henry came up the road on horseback, and as he was passing the school, he stopped to speak to the children playing on the mountainside. One of the boys came down and asked me if Henry could take Freckles up the mountain with him. I said, certainly. I was pleased for Freckles to have some exercise. He gamboled ahead of the horse, his tail carried high, and I envied them both their adventure in the cold, crisp sunshine. That evening I watched for their return in vain. I assumed they were staying overnight at Grandma Grinder's cabin. The next morning in school I asked where Freckles was, but nobody seemed to know. The following day I asked again, and answers were again evasive. I asked with some insistence, and at last somebody said, "Freckles is dead." "Dead!" I exclaimed, with a pang. "How did he die?" Again no answer was forthcoming, but I returned to the subject. "What has happened to Freckles?" I insisted. "Henry shot him," said Fred at last. I was aghast. What had I done to invite such an unfriendly act? I was so much upset that I had to go out of school to my house to recover. When I came back, after a few minutes, the children were uneasy. I talked to them and told them that on these winter days, after they had gone home from school, I had no one to talk to, and Freckles had been a real companion to me. In an English family, I said, the people would as soon think of shooting the baby as of shooting the dog. Shooting the baby, they echoed. They thought I was crazy. On calmer reflection, I could see Henry's side of the case, and realized that my comments had been extravagant. After all, the dog did not belong to me, but to Pete. I heard later that he had paid Pete $1 for it, and since dogs were supposed to live out of doors and work for their keep, Freckles, by his standards, was a useless piece of apparatus, so he shot him. Not long after this, Viva brought me a kitten. It did not occur to me at the time that this was perhaps a conciliatory gesture. I had never kept a cat and did not know what companionable little animals they can be, but I appreciated the kind intention and took the kitten in. He was an excellent mouser and would sit on the deep sill when my window was open and leap out into the darkness every now and again, to reappear with a mouse. This was very satisfactory, as I was still waging war on the rodents, but I did not approve of his choice of my bed for a mortuary. One night he jumped up to the window from the outside, but fell back again. I went out to see what was the matter. It was very dark, and he did not appear to be anywhere about, so I went inside again. When I went to bed, I left the window open. I woke up next morning to find the little cat lying on my bed in a pool of blood. In his neck was a round red hole. I moistened his lips with milk and tried to make him comfortable, but I was seething with rage. When the first children came to school, I told them, "Somebody has shot my cat." "Oh," said Viva in shocked tones. But Ralph was more practical. "Is he dead?" he asked. I shook my head. "Then nobody shot him," he said. "Let's see." They came into the bedroom and bent over the kitten. Then both spoke at once. "He's been attacked by a horned owl," they said. It seemed that in this valley cats did not have 9 lives. 3 young cats in a distance of a mile or so had succumbed to the attack of a horned owl. I tried to nurse the suffering little animal, but the wound began to smell, and as I saw Alfie passing on his way to the river, I signaled to him, and he took my kitten away in a sack. It was a great grief to me. On the next stage day after the Valentine party, the mail truck stopped on the road above the school in the afternoon on its way up the valley. I sent Edgar up to see what the driver wanted, and he came tottering back with a lovely case of Mackintosh red apples. I assumed that these had come down from the store at Jesmond, and the driver had forgotten to leave them on the way down. I was very glad to have them. I had had no fresh fruit since the fall. Then, a few nights later, came the explanation. I had that day fixed up a strong wire clothesline on a pulley, reaching from my house to the school. I had just put out my big lamp that night, preparatory to going to bed, when I heard wild cowboy yells and the thunder of galloping hoofs. I thrust my head out of the open window and hollered, "Watch out for the clothesline," because if they had gone on down the slope, they might have been dehatted, if not decapitated. It was a pitch-dark night. A surprised voice said, "Hey, you're supposed to be scared." "Am I?" I said. "Who is it?" "It's a couple of wild men," was the reply. One voice broke into song. "Well, come in," I said, "and let me see who you are." "Come in," they said, and I heard sounds of dismounting. I opened my door, and Manny and Norman, Michael's half-brother, staggered into the house. Norman carried a bottle of whiskey and urged me to have a drink. When I said I did not like whiskey, he said he would take the lariat off his horse and tie me up and pour the whole bottleful down my throat. I said I did not like castor oil either, or rice pudding. It was just that I did not like the taste of it. Manny told me that there was sanction in the Bible for drinking. "Let me tell you something, teacher," he said. "That, what's his name? That guy they put on a cross. Well, they were having a meeting or something once, and he said, 'Fill those pitchers with water.' And he told the story of the miracle quite well, but Manny had come with a purpose. There was something troubling him. He said, 'I want to apologize for making such a horse fool of myself at that dance. Gee, you gave me a wicked look. I thought I'd better get out.' I said to myself, 'Get out of here, son.' He was very anxious to know if he had been rude to me. He did not think for a moment that he would insult me, drunk or sober, but the others had told him that I had taken him and Jack over to my house and given them a good talking to, and that he had responded by calling me a string of dirty names. He was so scared that this might be true that he had sent me a box of Macintosh red apples of his own growing as a peace offering. I reassured him about his behavior and thanked him very much for his gift. During the winter months, the school had been in shadow all day, but now the morning sun was beginning to spill down the mountain slopes opposite, and every day it advanced a little further. When I awoke in the mornings, I glanced not at the clock, but at the mountains, gauging the time from the position of the line where sunshine and shadow met. There would be enough heat in the sunshine to thaw the surface of the snow during the day, but at night this froze again, making a dangerous surface to walk on. One glorious Sunday morning, I set off for the creek with my pails and went running down the slope into the bushes. Suddenly, my feet shot from under me, and I crashed down on my back, striking my right elbow and the back of my head with great force on the ice. I was brought to my senses by the chill of the moisture seeping through my clothing, and struggled to my feet and wove my way back to the cabin. I got between the blankets as fast as I could, and did not wake again until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The fire had been out for hours, and my pails were still empty, but there was just enough water in the kettle for a cup of tea. I wrote "Help" in white chalk on the outside of the door in large letters, hoping that someone might see it from the road. Then I went to bed again and slept till morning, by which time I was ravenously hungry, but otherwise none the worse. In school I told the children what had happened. Some of the boys had been around, but seeing my door shut, had thought I did not wish to be disturbed. They made little comment, but the next Sunday afternoon I had such a crowd of visitors that my 4 teacups had to be used in relays. And as it was easier now for movement in the valley, from then on passers-by on the road above would always wave down to me to establish contact. The weather was now warm enough for the children to play outside, and I used to wonder where they all disappeared to at morning break. One day I decided to follow them. They ran down to the creek and crossed by a log that spanned the stream where the ice had gone. Dark patches of open water boiled below. Michael and Douglas were across and twinkling, but Floyd hesitated. He studied the hazards, then went down on all fours and crossed like a bear cub. I could not allow myself to be beaten by this little boy, but my heart was in my mouth as I stepped across on the slippery log. Once across, I had to find the boys by sound, as they had disappeared in the underbrush. Michael had set a trap for squirrels halfway up a pine tree. There were no branches to give foothold on the lower part of the trunk, so he climbed onto a tall stump nearby and took a flying leap onto the pine tree. Then he stepped delicately from slender branch to branch until he reached his trap. It was empty. Douglas was luckier. His trap contained a squirrel which had only just been caught and was still struggling. He kicked it on the head and killed it at once. The next job was to skin it. He first made a stretcher on which to peg the skin to dry. This was a flat piece of wood with a curved point at the top, the shape of a church window. He took his squirrel and slit it up, both the back legs, and pulled the skin off the tail as you peel a glove off a finger. Douglas was not very adept at skinning, and the others laughed at his efforts, especially when he cut off the squirrel's ear. It had worried me at first that the dominant instinct of these children was to kill, and I urged them to leave the squirrels and chipmunks to run about the woods. But I came to realize that wild animals represented to them a source of subsistence. They provided meat to eat, and a means of obtaining money to buy such things as shoes and shirts. It was the equivalent of the city child's newspaper round.